In the small town of Ravens Hollow, there stood an antique shop wedged between an old bakery and a bookstore. Dusty and dimly lit, the shop was a labyrinth of forgotten treasures and eerie relics. Among the clutter, in a shadowy corner, stood a mirror. Its ornate silver frame was tarnished, and the glass bore faint smudges that seemed impossible to clean. A small brass plaque on the frame read, "The Eye of Eternity." Claire Thompson, a young journalist with a knack for exploring the unusual, stumbled upon the shop while researching an article on haunted objects. The owner, a frail old man with milky white eyes named Mr. Grayson, greeted her with a crooked smile. "You've got an eye for the peculiar," he rasped when Claire's gaze lingered on the mirror. "What's the story behind this?" Claire asked, brushing her fingers across the cold frame. Mr. Grayson's smile faded. "Some stories shouldn't be told, but if you're determined..." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This mirror doesn't show just your reflection, it shows them." "Them?" Claire prompted, intrigued. "The ones trapped between worlds, spirits, demons, echoes of the dead. Stare too long and you might see more than you bargained for." Claire, skeptical but fascinated, decided to buy the mirror. "I'll take it," she said, brushing off the old man's warnings as mere theatrics. That evening, Claire hauled the mirror into her apartment, setting it against the wall of her living room. She admired its craftsmanship, marveling at the intricate carvings of serpents and flowers that adorned the frame. As she stared at her reflection, the room seemed to grow colder. Shaking off the chill, she turned her attention to her notes, determined to write about the history of haunted mirrors. Hours passed, and the apartment grew quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Claire glanced at the mirror again. Her reflection looked back at her, but something felt off. The lighting in the mirror seemed dimmer, as though the room on the other side didn't share the same brightness. She leaned closer. That's when she saw it. A shadowy figure in the background, standing just beyond the frame. Claire whipped around, heart racing, but her apartment was empty. "Just my imagination," she muttered, shaking her head. But as she turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone. Over the next few days, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was more than it seemed. Late at night, she began hearing faint whispers, like the murmur of a crowd just out of earshot. She dismissed it as fatigue, but deep down, unease took root. One particularly late night, the whispers grew louder. Claire found herself unable to resist the pull of the mirror. She moved closer, staring into its depths. The reflection shifted. Her apartment faded into a swirling blackness, and faint outlines of figures began to emerge. They were not human. Elongated limbs, hollow eyes, and grotesque faces twisted into silent screams. "What are you?" Claire whispered, her breath fogging up the glass. "We are what waits." A chorus of voices replied, each layered over the other, as if dozens of entities were speaking in unison. The voices sent a chill down her spine. She stumbled back, grabbing her phone to record the phenomenon, but the moment she pressed record, the mirror returned to its ordinary reflection. On the fourth night, Claire invited her best friend, Megan, over. Megan was a skeptic, always quick to dismiss anything remotely supernatural. "A haunted mirror? Really, Claire?" Megan scoffed as she poured herself a glass of wine. "I'm serious," Claire insisted. "I saw something last night. Just look at it and tell me what you see." Megan rolled her eyes but approached the mirror. She stood in front of it, adjusting her hair, and smirked. "I see a gorgeous woman. Nothing spooky here." But as Megan spoke, her reflection remained still, staring at Claire with a cold, vacant expression. Claire froze, her wine glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. "What?" Megan asked, turning to Claire. Your reflection didn't move," Claire stammered. Megan turned back to the mirror, but her reflection now mimicked her movements perfectly. She frowned. "Okay, that's creepy." Before Claire could respond, a faint tapping sound echoed through the room. Both women turned to the mirror. The tapping grew louder, as though something was knocking on the other side of the glass. "Claire, what the hell is that?" Megan whispered, backing away. The tapping stopped, and for a moment the mirror was still. Then, a hand pressed against the glass from the inside. It was pale and skeletal, with long, jagged nails. A face emerged next, its hollow eyes locked onto Claire. "Help me," the figure whispered, its voice a raspy echo that seemed to fill the room. Megan screamed and bolted for the door, but Claire couldn't move. She was transfixed, unable to tear her eyes away from the mirror. The figure's face twisted into a grotesque smile, and the lights in the apartment flickered. "Claire!" Megan shouted, snapping her out of her trance. She grabbed Claire's arm, dragging her toward the door. The moment they crossed the threshold, the lights stopped flickering, and the apartment fell silent. The two women spent the night at Megan's place. Claire couldn't sleep, her mind racing with questions. Who was the figure in the mirror, and what did it want? The next morning, Claire returned to her apartment, determined to get rid of the mirror. But when she walked in, it was gone. The wall where it had stood was bare, as though it had never been there at all. She called Mr. Grayson, demanding answers. The old man sighed heavily. "You didn't listen," he said. "The mirror chooses its keeper. If it's gone, it's because it's finished with you." "Finished with me? What does that mean?" Claire asked, her voice rising. But Mr. Grayson had already hung up. Over the next few days, Claire's life returned to normal, or so it seemed. But every so often, she caught glimpses of movement in reflective surfaces. The gleam of a kitchen knife, the sheen of her phone screen, even the darkened TV when it was off. Faces stared back at her, fleeting but unmistakable. One night, as she brushed her teeth, the bathroom mirror fogged up from the steam. Slowly, words appeared, written in the condensation, "I'm still here." Claire's scream echoed through the apartment, but no one was there to hear it. The following week, Claire began experiencing vivid nightmares. In them, she was trapped in a dark, endless corridor lined with mirrors. Each one showed her distorted reflection, twisted and grotesque. A voice, deep and otherworldly, whispered in her ear, "You'll never escape." By day, the strange occurrences escalated. Objects in her apartment moved on their own. Lights flickered at odd intervals, and always the reflections followed her, watching from every shiny surface. Desperate for answers, Claire returned to the antique shop. But when she arrived, the shop was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. She stood there, heart pounding, as a cold wind swept through the hollow space. "What do you want from me?" she screamed into the void. No answer came, but as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a puddle on the ground. The figure staring back wasn't her. It was the face from the mirror, grinning wickedly. Months later, a new antique shop opened in a neighboring town. Among its wares stood a familiar mirror, its silver frame gleaming in the dim light. A young couple wandered in, admiring the curiosities. The husband stopped in front of the mirror, tilting his head. "This would look great in our living room," he said. The shopkeeper smiled. "Ah, an excellent choice. But I must warn you, this mirror has a history." The couple laughed, brushing off the warning. As they walked out with their new purchase, the mirror's surface rippled, and a shadowy figure smiled from within. Claire's story didn't end there. She began documenting every strange event she encountered, filling notebooks with sketches of the faces she saw and the whispers she heard. Her obsession grew, driving her deeper into isolation. Friends drifted away, unable to understand the shadow that hung over her. One stormy evening, she awoke to find her room bathed in a pale, flickering light. The mirror was back, standing exactly where it had been. This time, it was glowing faintly, as if calling to her. Trembling, she approached. As her reflection came into view, she realized it wasn't hers. It was the skeletal figure, now fully solid, standing in her place. It raised its hand, beckoning her closer. "It's time," it said. The words echoed, filling the room with a bone-chilling resonance. Claire screamed, but no one heard her. When the neighbors came to check on her the next day, all they found was an empty apartment and a mirror standing in the center of the room. To this day, the mirror waits for its next keeper, its surface rippling with shadows of those it has claimed.